There's a version of Dolly Parton that the world has always known. She smiles easily, speaks gently, and knows exactly how to disarm a room. For decades, that version of her has felt almost permanent, someone who turns tension into humor and conflict into charm. But that public image, carefully maintained over a lifetime, didn't come without cost. Behind it was a discipline of silence, a choice to soften difficult truths rather than confront them directly. What makes her story more compelling is not just her success, but the moments where that silence became difficult to sustain, particularly when it came to one of the most celebrated collaborations in American music, her work alongside Linda Ronstadt and Emmylou Harris. On the surface, it looked like a meeting of equals, three artists at the peak of their influence coming together to create something timeless. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was. But creative partnerships, even the most iconic ones, are rarely as seamless as they appear. By the time the idea of these three voices joining forces became serious, Dolly was operating on an entirely different scale. She wasn't just a musician anymore, she was a business force, a media presence, and a cultural institution. Her schedule reflected that. Every decision was fast, every commitment stacked on top of another. Momentum wasn't just a preference, it was how she survived professionally. Ronstadt and Harris came from a different rhythm. Their approach to music leaned toward patience, detail, and immersion. Where Dolly moved quickly, they lingered. Where she trusted instinct, they trusted refinement. These weren't flaws, they were philosophies. And at first, those differences added depth rather than friction. Their early collaborations hinted at something rare. When their voices blended, it didn't feel forced. It felt inevitable. That sense of natural harmony carried into their first major project together, which was widely praised for its balance and restraint. Critics saw it as a triumph, not just musically but symbolically. Three powerful women, each with distinct identities, creating something unified without losing themselves in the process. But success can be deceptive. It tends to hide the small tensions that later become impossible to ignore. Once the initial excitement faded, practical realities began to surface. Scheduling became complicated. Communication slowed. What once felt effortless now required coordination, compromise, and patience, three things that don't always coexist easily in high-pressure creative environments. For Dolly, time was always the most limited resource. Her world didn't allow for long pauses or extended indecision. That urgency shaped how she worked and what she expected from others. For Ronstadt, that same urgency could feel like pressure. She believed that music needed space, that rushing the process risked losing something essential. Harris often found herself between those perspectives, understanding both but unable to fully reconcile them. What's striking about this period isn't that conflict existed, it's that it remained mostly unspoken. There were no dramatic public clashes, no explosive moments that define the narrative. Instead, the tension built quietly, shaped by missed connections, differing expectations, and the slow realization that alignment was becoming harder to maintain. When discussions of a second project began, the tone had already shifted. The collaboration was no longer new, the dynamic was no longer being discovered, it was being tested. And under that pressure, differences that once felt complementary began to feel incompatible. Dolly's efficiency, once an asset, started to be perceived differently. Her absence, often due to an overwhelming schedule, created delays that affected everyone involved. From her perspective, she was doing everything she could within the limits of her commitments. From the outside, it sometimes looked like inconsistency. That gap in perception became one of the central challenges. For someone like Dolly, whose career had been built on reliability and follow-through, the idea that her commitment might be questioned was deeply personal. It wasn't just about a delayed session or a missed call. It was about identity. She had spent years proving that she could deliver, often in environments where she wasn't expected to succeed. So when doubt entered the picture, even subtly, it carried weight far beyond the immediate situation. At the same time, Ronstadt and Harris were dealing with their own frustrations. From their perspective, the collaboration required a level of presence that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Their concerns weren't about undermining Dolly, they were about sustaining the integrity of the project. And that's where things became complicated, because both sides in their own way were right. This wasn't a story of clear villains or obvious mistakes. It was a situation where different working styles, equally valid on their own, struggled to coexist under pressure. The more time passed, the harder it became to separate intention from impact. Even moments of humor, something Dolly was known for, started to carry a different tone. Jokes that might once have lightened the atmosphere began to hint at underlying frustration. They weren't confrontations, but they weren't entirely neutral either. In creative environments, those subtle shifts matter. They shape how people interpret each other, how they respond, and how trust evolves or erodes. And trust, more than anything else, was what this collaboration depended on. By the time they moved closer to actually working on a follow-up project, the foundation had already weakened. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough that every new challenge felt heavier than it should have. The partnership that once seemed effortless was now navigating something far more complex, the space between respect and resentment. By the time Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris moved from discussion back into actual collaboration, the atmosphere had already shifted in ways that were difficult to ignore. What had once felt like a natural extension of shared artistry now carried a quiet tension. There was no single moment where things went wrong. Instead, it was a gradual accumulation, small misunderstandings, different expectations, and the weight of time pressing on a partnership that no longer felt as fluid as it once had. The studio, which had previously been a place of discovery for them, began to feel more like a space of negotiation. Each decision, whether about song choice, arrangement, or timing, required more discussion than before. That wasn't inherently a problem. Many great projects are built through careful debate, but here, the discussions were shaped by underlying differences that had never fully been resolved. What once felt collaborative now occasionally felt cautious, for Dolly. Stepping into that environment meant adjusting a pace that had defined her entire career. She was used to moving quickly, trusting her instincts and building momentum through action. Slowing down wasn't just inconvenient, it disrupted the rhythm that allowed her to manage an already overwhelming workload. Every extended session, every prolonged decision-making process, added pressure in ways that others in the room may not have fully recognized. Ronstadt approached those same moments differently. For her, the studio was not a place to rush toward completion. It was a place to explore, refine, and ensure that every detail felt right. That approach required time, and more importantly, it required a willingness to sit with uncertainty. Where Dolly saw delays, Ronstadt often saw necessary steps toward quality. Neither perspective was wrong, but they were increasingly difficult to reconcile. Harris, positioned between those two approaches, carried a different kind of challenge. She understood the value in both speed and patience. She could see why Dolly needed momentum, and she could also see why Ronstadt insisted on precision. But understanding doesn't always translate into resolution. Being able to interpret both sides didn't give her the power to align them, and over time that middle ground became harder to hold. As sessions progressed, the emotional tone of the collaboration became more noticeable. There were still moments of genuine connection, times when their voices blended in ways that reminded everyone why the project existed in the first place. But those moments were increasingly surrounded by stretches of uncertainty. The contrast made the tension more visible, not less. One of the more subtle shifts was in how communication unfolded. Conversations that might once have been direct became more measured. Words were chosen carefully, sometimes to avoid conflict, sometimes to manage it. But careful communication can create its own kind of distance. When people begin filtering themselves too heavily, it often signals that something deeper is at risk. For Dolly, that risk was tied closely to trust. Her career had been built on a reputation for reliability. When she committed to something, she followed through. So when delays began to define the project, and when those delays seemed to reflect back on her, it created a sense of discomfort that went beyond scheduling. It felt personal, even if no one explicitly made it so. At the same time, Ronstadt and Harris were navigating their own concerns about consistency. From their perspective, the collaboration depended on a shared level of presence that was becoming harder to maintain. Their frustration wasn't about diminishing Dolly's contributions, it was about sustaining a process that required all three of them to move in sync, and that synchronization was becoming increasingly difficult. These parallel frustrations created a situation where each side felt justified, yet misunderstood. Dolly felt that her efforts were being undervalued, that the realities of her schedule were not fully appreciated. Ronstadt and Harris felt that the integrity of the project was being compromised by inconsistency. Both perspectives existed at the same time, and neither fully canceled out the other. At one point, practical solutions began to enter the conversation. The idea of adjusting the structure of the project, perhaps recording in a way that required less simultaneous presence, was considered. From a logistical standpoint, it made sense. It could have allowed the work to continue without the same level of scheduling conflict. But emotionally, it carried a different weight. For Dolly, the suggestion of modifying her role even slightly raised deeper questions. It wasn't just about logistics, it was about identity within the collaboration. She had entered the project as an equal partner. Any shift that suggested a reduced presence risked changing that dynamic, even if unintentionally. The distinction between practicality and perception became difficult to separate. Her response reflected that complexity. She wasn't rejecting the idea out of stubbornness. She was responding to what it represented. Being part of the project meant being fully part of it, not adjusting her involvement in a way that felt conditional. It was a stance rooted in self-respect, but it also made compromise harder to achieve. As these discussions unfolded, the emotional weight of the collaboration continued to grow. The focus, which had once been entirely on the music, now included layers of interpretation, what decisions meant, how they were perceived, and what they implied about each person's commitment. That added dimension made even simple choices feel more significant than they might otherwise have been. Despite all of this, the work did continue. Songs were recorded, arrangements were shaped, progress, though uneven, was still progress, and in many ways the music itself remained strong. The talent in the room hadn't diminished. If anything, the tension added a certain depth to the performances, a sense of emotional complexity that can't always be manufactured intentionally. But strong material doesn't automatically resolve strained dynamics. In fact, it can sometimes highlight them. The better the results, the more noticeable the contrast between what's being created and how it's being created. That contrast became part of the experience for all three artists. Another important factor was how time influenced perception. As the process stretched out, delays began to feel less like temporary obstacles and more like defining characteristics of the project. What might have been manageable in a shorter time frame became more difficult to carry over months and eventually years. Patience, even when it's valued, has limits. For Dolly, that extended timeline amplified the internal conflict she was already feeling. She understood why frustration existed, and she acknowledged her role in the situation. But understanding doesn't always reduce emotional impact. In some cases, it intensifies it. Knowing that you've contributed to a problem while also feeling misunderstood within it creates a particularly complex kind of pressure. Ronstadt and Harris, on their side, were dealing with the practical reality of a project that wasn't moving as expected. Their investment, both creative and emotional, remained, but the uncertainty surrounding its completion added a layer of strain. They weren't just waiting, they were trying to determine how to move forward in a situation that no longer had clear momentum. Through all of this, what stands out is how much remained unspoken. There were no defining confrontations that resolved the tension. Instead, there was a gradual shift in how each person related to the project and to each other. Distance didn't arrive suddenly, it developed over time, shaped by repeated challenges that never fully found resolution. By the later stages of recording, the collaboration had become something different from what it started as. It was still meaningful, still capable of producing powerful music, but it was no longer effortless. Every step forward required more intention, more negotiation, and more emotional energy than before. And yet, despite everything, they finished the work. The recordings were completed, the material existed, and on the surface, that might have seemed like the hardest part. But in reality, finishing the album didn't bring closure. It simply marked the end of one phase and the beginning of another, one where decisions about release, promotion, and ownership would introduce a new set of challenges. What had been built in the studio was now carrying unresolved tension into the next stage of its life. And that meant the story wasn't over. It was about to become even more complicated when the recordings were finally complete. It might have seemed like the most difficult part of the journey was behind Dolly Parton, Linda Ronstadt, and Emmylou Harris. The songs existed, the performances were captured, and the collaboration, at least in its technical form, had reached the finish line. But completion didn't bring clarity. Instead, it exposed a new set of tensions that had less to do with creation and more to do with control, timing, and trust. For Dolly, finishing the album was only part of the responsibility. How that work entered the world mattered just as much as how it was made. She believed deeply in presentation, in giving a project the attention, timing, and care it deserved. To her, releasing an album wasn't just a business step, it was an extension of the creative process. And after everything it had taken to complete this collaboration, she wanted that final step to reflect its importance. But the reality of the situation didn't align with that vision. Decisions about the album's release began to move forward in ways that didn't fully include her. From a practical standpoint, there were reasons for that. The project had already taken years to complete. There was pressure to move ahead, to avoid further delays, and to bring closure to something that had been in limbo for too long. But for Dolly, the way those decisions unfolded felt unsettling. It wasn't just about disagreement. It was about feeling out of sync with a project she had helped build. That sense of being out of alignment added another layer to an already complicated emotional landscape. She was aware of her own role in the delays. She knew her schedule had made things harder. But at the same time, she felt that the final decisions didn't fully reflect her commitment or her perspective. That combination, recognizing responsibility while also feeling overlooked, created a tension that was difficult to resolve internally. For Ronstadt and Harris, the situation looked different. From where they stood, the album had reached a point where it needed to move forward, regardless of lingering complications. Their focus shifted toward completion in a practical sense, ensuring that the work they had invested in didn't remain indefinitely unreleased. It wasn't about dismissing Dolly's concerns, it was about bringing a prolonged process to an end. These differing priorities once again highlighted the core challenge of the collaboration: alignment. Even after the music was finished, the three artists were still approaching the project from different angles. Dolly saw the release as a moment that required intention and care. Ronstadt and Harris saw it as a necessary step toward closure. Both perspectives had merit, but they didn't fully overlap. As time passed, the delay between completion and release began to take on its own significance. What had once been a creative partnership now felt in some ways like an unresolved chapter. The longer the album remained unheard, the more it carried the weight of everything that had happened during its creation. It was no longer just a collection of songs, it was a record of a process that had been both meaningful and difficult. For Dolly, that waiting period became particularly heavy. She wasn't just thinking about the music, she was reflecting on the experience behind it. The missed connections, the misunderstandings, the moments where trust felt uncertain, all of it stayed with her. And without a clear resolution, those feelings didn't fade, they settled. When the album was eventually released, it entered a world that responded exactly as many had expected. Critics recognized the quality of the work. The performances were praised for their depth and subtlety. The collaboration, even after its complicated journey, still produced something undeniably strong. On paper, it was a success, but success doesn't always feel the way it looks. For Dolly, the external validation didn't fully connect with her internal experience. The applause was real, but it arrived after the most emotionally challenging parts of the journey had already passed. What people were celebrating was the outcome. What she remembered was the process, and those two things didn't align as neatly as they might have from the outside. That disconnect created a quiet kind of contradiction. Listeners heard harmony, balance, and cohesion. Dolly remembered tension, uncertainty, and moments where the collaboration felt fragile. Neither perspective was wrong, they were simply different reflections of the same reality. Ronstadt, when speaking about the collaboration in later years, often framed it in professional terms. She acknowledged the strength of what they created and the respect they shared for each other's artistry. At the same time, there was a noticeable distance in how she described the experience. It wasn't defined by conflict, but it wasn't defined by closeness either. That tone suggested something important. The collaboration had worked, but it hadn't remained personal in the way some might have expected. Harris maintained a similarly balanced perspective. She recognized the uniqueness of what the three of them had accomplished, but she also understood the challenges that came with it. Being in the middle of those dynamics had given her insight into both sides, and over time, that insight translated into acceptance rather than resolution. For all three artists, moving forward meant something slightly different. There was no dramatic ending, no public fallout that marked a clear conclusion. Instead, there was a gradual shift towards separate paths. The collaboration, once a central focus, became part of their histories rather than their present. Dolly, in particular, carried the emotional weight of the experience in a way that shaped how she later reflected on it. She didn't frame it as a failure. She didn't assign blame in a direct or public way. Instead, she approached it with a kind of measured honesty, acknowledging both the strength of what they created and the difficulty of how it came together. In her reflections, she admitted that she had been part of the problem. That aligning everything, schedules, expectations, communication, had been harder than she allowed herself to recognize at the time. That admission wasn't dramatic, but it was significant. It showed a willingness to look back without defensiveness, even when the experience had been painful. At the same time, that honesty didn't erase what had been felt. Acknowledging responsibility doesn't automatically dissolve resentment, it simply places it in a clearer context. For Dolly, the emotions connected to the collaboration remained complex, part pride, part regret, part unresolved tension. What never emerged from the situation was a true return. There was no third project that attempted to rebuild what had been strained, not because it was impossible, but because it would have required revisiting a dynamic that had already taken a significant emotional toll. Sometimes, the absence of continuation says more than any formal ending could. In the years that followed, each of them continued to build on their already remarkable careers. Their individual legacies grew, shaped by new projects, new directions, and new experiences. The collaboration remained an important chapter, but it was not one they chose to extend. Looking back, what makes this story compelling isn't conflict in the traditional sense. There were no explosive arguments that defined it, no single moment that explains everything. Instead, it's a study in how creative brilliance can coexist with emotional complexity, how respect can exist alongside frustration, how something successful can still feel unfinished. For Dolly, perhaps the most lasting realization was that silence, something she had relied on throughout her career, has limits. There are moments where not addressing tension allows it to grow in ways that are harder to manage later. And while she handled the situation with grace publicly, privately it left an impression that didn't fully fade. In the end, what she acknowledged wasn't anger in a dramatic sense, but something quieter, a lingering sense of being misunderstood, of having intentions that didn't fully translate, of participating in something meaningful that also carried a cost she hadn't anticipated. That complexity is what gives the story its depth. It reminds us that collaboration, even at the highest level, is not just about talent. It's about timing, communication, and the ability to align not just creatively but emotionally. When those elements fall out of balance, even the strongest partnerships can become difficult to sustain. And yet the music remains. Long after the tension has faded into memory, the work continues to exist on its own terms, separate from the circumstances that created it. Listeners can experience it without knowing the full story behind it. They can hear only what was achieved, not what it took to achieve it. For the artists themselves, however, those two things are inseparable, so what we're left with is not a simple narrative of success or failure but something more nuanced. a reminder that greatness often comes with complications, and that even the most respected voices can struggle to stay in harmony when the conditions around them begin to shift.